finishing discussion about unemployment and how it comes about and what influences things like the unemployment rate, the natural unemployment rate. So what influences structural unemployment and frictional unemployment? We said the wage rate. How might the wage rate influence it? Well, for example, if we've got something like a minimum wage, or we've got something like an efficiency wage, how would those affect things? Let me just draw that in a diagram here as well. So, if we have, if we have the labor market, so we've got employment. I'm just going to call employment L, and you got here the real wage. Real wage we write as W over P, so the nominal wage is W. And we got the demand for labor, which is a function of productivity, and we got the supply of labor, which would have got its own factors. So one of those factors would be how many people you have in your population. This would be our full employment level. So we'd have some level of labor employment, which is associated with some level of unemployment, and that level of unemployment would be the natural unemployment rate, right? So at that unemployment rate, at that level of unemployment, so at this equilibrium position, we know that we would have frictional and structural unemployment. Okay? So in other words, these are people that the only reason that they're not working is because they don't currently have a job. It's not a cyclical issue. Remember, frictional people are just in between jobs. Structural people, there's something holding them back, right? They're not skilled at this point. Now, here is our equilibrium real wage rate at this point here. Let's say that there is a minimum wage that's implemented, and the minimum wage says you have to employ at least this wage level here. Okay, so W over P1. Okay, I'm going to call this one here, I'm going to call the equilibrium wage WPF. Okay. If the minimum wage is WP1 but the market clearing wage is WPF, which wage are employers going to have to pay? The minimum wage, or are they going to pay the market clearing wage, assuming this is a perfectly competitive market? Sorry?
They're not paying the minimum wage.
Okay. So, if employers were paying a minimum wage, how much labor would they demand? Some quantity of labor here, call it QLA. Okay? How much labor do people want to supply? Call it QLB. What do we see in this labor market at the minimum wage level? Yeah, we would. Okay, I'm not going to say we're going to see unemployment yet because there's something else I want to talk about. What else? At that minimum wage level, what is the problem in the market here? Sorry, what? Shortage what? Shortage of labor. Is there a shortage of, yeah. In other words, the number of people that are offering to supply work at that wage level is less than the number of people that are demanded for work. What does that do to wages? What does that do to wages? It puts upward pressure on wages. This is macroeconomic stuff, right? This is core of economics. When you've got demand exceeding supply, when you've got quantity demanded greater than quantity supplied, what happens to prices? They are bid upwards. So wage level increases. As wage level increases, the gap gets smaller and smaller until we reach equilibrium. Right? So at that minimum wage level, is it going to be a binding minimum wage? Do employers end up paying the minimum wage? No, because it's set at a wage lower than what clears the market anyway. Right? Okay, let's say that instead there was a minimum wage set over here, W over P, minimum wage set here. Okay? So this is a minimum wage. Okay, at our minimum wage level number 2, the government says you may not pay wages lower than this level. What wage do employers pay their employees? Do they pay WPF or do they pay WP2? Is everyone happy that they must pay WP2? Why? Because they are not allowed to pay a wage lower than this wage level. What do we know? In this market, this is the quantity of labor demanded. Okay, at this point here. At this point here, we have the quantity of labor that laborers wish to supply. The quantity of labor supplied is much greater than the quantity demanded. What would ordinarily happen if this was a perfectly competitive market? The wage level would get bid down. It cannot get bid down because there is a legal restriction on the wage that will get paid. So how many people will be employed in this market? Will it be at the quantity corresponding to 0.1 or the quantity corresponding to 0.2? How many people get employed? You happy that it's the quantity of people at 0.1, right? The limitation is on the demand side, not on the supply side. If at 0.1 this is how many people we are employing, some quantity here, call it L1, are you happy that L1 here is less than the full employment level we would have without the minimum wage? Right? There are more people that want to be employed but cannot be employed because of, well, not cyclical reasons. Right? Hence, the real wage can influence our natural rate of unemployment, especially if we have things like minimum wages or efficiency wages. Yes? An efficiency wage is, and I'll get to your question just now, something along the lines of, let's say I'm an employer and I've got employees in front of me, right? And you are one of my employees and I think you're really great. Now, your year-end review will go really well. So, you are an excellent employee and you have a certain skill level, and in terms of what the market would pay you, I know what that rate is and I'm paying you that rate, right? But now that you've been here for a while and I realize how awesome you are, I don't want to lose you to a competitor. So I agreed to pay you more, right, than what you would get in the market generally, so that you stay with me, right? That's an efficiency wage. So when I want to keep people in my company and not send them out into the market for whatever reason, you pay extra to keep those people that you really want, right? Unemployment benefits as well can influence the natural rate of unemployment. Why? Because any kind of unemployment benefits change the incentive for actually entering the labor force and doing work. In other words, any kind of benefits change the opportunity cost of looking for a job. And in fact, those benefits could lower the cost, and it could lower the cost in a way that increases the unemployment rate, or it could lower the cost in a way that decreases the unemployment rate. Yeah.
What kind of unemployment would you say was caused by rising living wage?
I didn't specify exactly what kind of unemployment it would be, but you would think it would probably increase both frictional and structural. Because if you're frictional in between jobs, right, and you're looking for a job, you're probably going to have to wait even longer just because there's more people looking for jobs. So it takes you longer to find a job to move into. Structurally, you probably at that wage level, you won't really be able to find a job. Given your current skill set, you need to upskill in order for someone to actually be happy to employ you at that higher wage level. Okay. Good question. And then the final point on the slide, real GDP and unemployment over the cycle. Well, we saw that in this diagram over here. Okay, so we've covered that graphically, which I think helps to put everything into perspective. So for you can get out your piece of paper and your scribbling device, and here's a question from the previous exam based on the unemployment stuff. You got a diagram. The diagram shows you that we have a working age population of 7,500. We've got those that are not economically active as 3,000, and we've got those that are not not available to work. In other words, they are not prepared to supply work at 1,900. And then the other information you've got is that there's some number of employed, there's some number of unemployed, there's the total labor force, and over here we've got those who are available to work but have not taken any steps to find work. In other words, these are guys called discouraged workers, so they are not part of the not economically active, if you recall, but we don't know how many people are there. Okay? The question here in question 7 from the previous exam, what is the approximate broad unemployment rate? So what is the broad unemployment rate? It's discussed in your textbook. I'll give you the page reference and then you can answer the question.
I just honestly don't know how to do it
Without having the number of discouraged workers. Okay, what is important about having the number of discouraged workers?
Because they give you
You want broad, right?
yeah.
So how do you calculate broad, given the equation that you've got there? You would have, for example, right, the number of unemployed plus the number of discouraged, right, divided by the labor force plus the number of discouraged, right? So you're saying that you need this number over here, right? Okay, so you know that this total here is 3,000. You know that those that are not available for work is this number here, right? So that would mean that this number here is this number over here minus this number over here equals this number over here. What do you think?
Yeah, sorry, I thought it was it.
Sorry, you thought?
It was it.
Oh, right, okay.
Sorry.
No, that's cool, good. Okay, so you're happy with that then?
Yes, thank you.
Once you've got that, you're happy?
Yes, thank you.
Okay? Cool. Anyone else? You've been given not economically active and not available for work. We're asking for broad unemployment How does the broad unemployment measure from our measure differ from our normal unemployment measure? Our normal unemployment measure is the number of unemployed divided by the labor force. Our broad unemployment measure is the number of employed plus discouraged workers divided by labor force plus discouraged workers. So we need to, sorry, I've got the wrong color here. So we need to know the number of unemployed, the labor force, and discouraged workers. Each of these we can calculate. Discouraged workers is not given to us, but we're told there are 3,000 not economically active, and of those 1,900 are not available for work. So what is our remaining discouraged workers? 3,000 minus 1,900, 1,100. What is our labor force? Well, we know that the working age population is 7,500. We know that the not economically active is 3,000. Therefore, our labor force must be, well, 7,500 minus 3,000 equals 4,500. How many of those 4,500 are unemployed? 19%. So the unemployed are 0.19 times 4,500, and I don't know what that number is. Anyone? Sorry, 855. Okay, so then we've got 855 plus 1100 divided by 455 plus 1100, and I get as a percentage, well, I should do. You can verify it on a calculator if you've got one. Okay, everyone happy with that now? Any questions? Now is the time to ask if you have a question. Okay, we're now moving on to inflation. First distinction to make, and we've only got a couple of minutes to begin our discussion here, but we should be able to get through at least these first few slides. So, price level. The price level is different to inflation and is different to deflation. What is inflation? Inflation is when the price level is persistently rising. In other words, it continues to rise. Deflation is persistently falling. Price, should really say here, price level. Oop. Okay. Yeah, so this should say price level. Okay. In technical terms, inflation then is therefore change in P. But a once-off change in P, in other words, prices just happen to change once and then they stop changing, that wouldn't be considered inflation. Inflation means that prices change a little bit today, a little bit tomorrow, a little bit the next day, a little bit the next day, and they're just continuously changing. Okay? If they're continuously going up, then it's inflation. If they are continuously going down, then it's deflation. So, having got those technical definitions out of the way, why would inflation be a problem? So the first point to note is that if you have low levels of inflation, and that low level of inflation is anticipated, in other words, people expect it. Inflation is low, everyone knows that there's going to be low inflation, then that's actually not really a problem. Experience suggests that that's really not a problem. The textbook says that deflation is not a problem. I'm not so sure that we are as certain about the fact that deflation is not a problem. But the key takeaway from this is that if it's low and it's anticipated, the change in price is not really going to cause a problem. Where we really get problems is if it's high, or especially if it's unexpected. If there's an unexpected change in prices, that's a problem. Why? Because it distorts things in the economy. What sort of distortions happen? Well, for one, it redistributes income. How does it redistribute income? Wages and things like that are usually set at the beginning of a period with expectations of what inflation will be during that period. So when you hear on the news that COSATU is going on a strike, they will demand some kind of increase in wages that the employers are not prepared to pay. They then enter a bargaining process, and they come to some sort of an agreement. And the labor unions say, right, we will accept 7% wage increase. Okay? By accepting a 7% wage increase, they expect inflation to be less than 7%. How do we know they expect inflation to be less than 7%? Sorry. Because if inflation was more than 7% during that period, so let's say inflation was 10%, but the workers that the union represents only got paid 7% more, what would that mean in terms of their real wage? They've been paid 7% more, but everything they want to buy costs 10% more. What's happened to the real wage of those workers? It's gone down. Are you with me? You happy that, in fact, they can buy less now with their wages than they could at the beginning of the period? If their wage has only increased by 7%, but all the stuff they want to buy has increased by 10%, they can, by definition, buy less with their wages than what they could at the beginning of the period. Is everyone comfortable with that? Okay? Which means laborers are not going to go ask for a wage increase, which leaves them with lower wages at the end of the period. So if they agree on 7%, that means they expect inflation to be less than 7%. If inflation is more than 7%, what happens? In effect, their wages go down, and the profits of the company, of the shareholders, of the employers, the people who are employing, the profits of the company would then in effect go up. They are selling their goods at a higher price, at 10% higher price, but their wage costs have only gone up by 7%. They are taking a bigger profit cut. You happy with that? In other words, income then gets redistributed away from the laborers to the employers. So income gets redistributed. An unexpected, I don't know why they use the word burst, but okay. An unexpected increase in inflation raises prices but does not immediately raise wages. Workers are worse off, right? Redistributed away from workers. Redistributed away from workers. If there was an increase in inflation, redistribution away from workers. What happens if inflation is in fact lower than what everyone expected? So the laborers and the employers come together. They expect prices to increase by 7%, but prices only increase by 2%. Laborers are getting paid a lot more relative to what prices had increased by. The profits of the employers are therefore decreasing because they're paying more in wages than what they had anticipated. So what happens when you have then a decrease in inflation? Are you happy that a decrease in inflation would be the opposite? In other words, redistribution away from employers. Okay, so if we have a decrease, in other words, there's inflation is not as high as what people thought it was going to be, inflation is not what people expected, and it's lower than what people expected, then you get redistribution away from employers. So either redistribution away from workers or away from employers. Okay. It also redistributes wealth and potentially lowers GDP. But we will talk about that tomorrow. So this is where we will begin tomorrow.